The Center for Educational Media and the College of Education at Middle Tennessee State University are proud to offer professional development to K-12 teachers in Tennessee through our online video library. These videos are aligned with the Tennessee academic standards. For more professional development videos, check out our website at cem.mtsu.edu. This video is aligned with the following Tennessee academic standards.
So our workshop today is Teaching History Today, Content and Strategies for World and U.S. History. Our Teaching with Primary Sources program is funded through the Library of Congress. We are one of about 25 currently funded projects in the country that are funded through the Library of Congress, working on really teacher outreach and thinking about how we use primary sources in the classroom, really focused on using primary sources from the Library of Congress. So we offer professional development across the state of Tennessee. We typically, on average, do about 3 events a month, and those are all free. There's never a charge for any of our workshops. And that's something that you can come and join us for. Some of them are focused on strategies, other of them are focused on content. We kind of mix it up a little bit. We also have a website where we will post different educational materials that we have created, all that align with Tennessee State curriculum standards. And so during the strategy sessions today, a lot of the things that we'll be showing you are actually resources available on our website. And we'll actually be walking through and actually showing you how we have thought about using the primary sources as we've developed these different resources and materials. Our topic for this first session, which is primary source analysis and historical thinking skills. This, of course, works not just for social studies, but also English language arts. And when you look at our materials, you'll see a lot of times that we actually will bring in a lot of English language arts standards as well. So the basics to primary source analysis. Of course, when we think about what do we want students to achieve when they start to analyze a source, we want them, of course, to get a better understanding of the past and complexities of history. We want them not to just look at a source like this and be like, yeah, that looks old. We want them to actually start to peel back the layers, right? And so that they can think about, okay, well, what can I learn from this source? What does this tell me about the time period in which it was created? And they can start to ask kind of a series of questions that will help them to figure out what we can learn from this source, not just, well, that looks interesting and it looks old. And so we want to actually begin to kind of get them to delve into, connect this to the material that they're reading in their textbooks. The other goal for analysis, of course, is to develop higher order thinking skills. When we begin to analyze, we're going to start to ask ourselves a series of questions that hopefully will build upon themselves to develop those higher order thinking skills. And then, of course, critical thinking skills. And so when we, yes, ma'am?
I just wonder, is this on your website too, these slides? Or?
I can make them available, yes.
That would be nice.
Yes. Okay. Yes, we can make them available. And so when we're going through and we're looking at analysis, we really are trying to develop a set of skills in our students so that when they look at a source, they basically ingrain in themselves a series of questions that they begin to ask themselves anytime they look at a source that can build upon, that each question builds upon itself so that they can actually uncover more information about the source. And this really is part of inquiry. And so when we think about primary source analysis, we think about the beginning steps of inquiry. And so we would start here with connect. And so when we have students, we put a primary source in front of them, we want them to begin to connect with that source. We want them to start thinking about, what observations can they make, what do they know about it, and then they can begin to process through these other steps of the inquiry cycle. And so they can go from connect to wonder, and so that they can think about, what do they want to learn? Basically, when I look at the source, what questions do I have? What do I want to know? What kind of predictions can I make? What kind of, kind of thoughts do I have about it? And then once they develop those kind of predictions, those questions, then they can move into, okay, well, maybe I need now to answer those questions. And so we can go into thinking about what other sources we want to look at. And when we look at those other sources, what information is important here? How do I begin to evaluate this additional information and use that to construct new knowledge? And so that when I'm looking at these additional source materials and I'm starting to try to answer my questions from that initial primary source analysis, I'm actually beginning to think about evidence and how I can support conclusions, and then how I can begin to express that. So once I have this new knowledge, what do I do with it? And then finally, we want them to end with reflection. We want them to think about, why does this matter? What new questions do I have? And so that really primary source analysis is the foundation for this type of higher level thinking and learning. And so a lot of times when you look within your ELA standards for for reading informational text and for writing, a lot of this really fits in with what that is asking to do. And when you look at your standards within social studies, some of those really more complex standards that are out there really also kind of get at this type of thinking as well. But it all starts with that connect and wonder. And so really we can break that down to 3 basic questions. So that when students look at a source, they ask themselves 3 questions to begin with. We want them to think about, what do they see, what do they know, and what do they wonder. So for just a moment, let's think about this image here. What do we see here?
A lot of people.
A lot of people, okay.
A lot of debris.
A lot of debris, okay. There's all kinds of stuff here on the...
Urban.
I'm sorry?
Urban area.
It's an urban area, yeah.
You see booths or stalls set up?
Right, we see, there's, looks like maybe kind of booths and stalls here along the way.
They're dressed different than we are now.
Right, we notice their clothing.
It's daytime.
It's daytime.
No cars.
There's no,
It does not look like it's cold.
All right, it doesn't look cold.
Picture's black and white.
It's black and white.
The buildings just keep going,
Okay.
and they look the same.
Yeah, so we see kind of multi-story buildings that kind of run along a row as far as we can see in the image. Similar architecture for the building fronts.
Are there carriages in the background? Are those carriages?
There is. I can't tell if these are kind of older type cars or if they're carriages. But yeah.
There's a young man in the front, a boy.
All right, so we see, a
And
young.
he's wearing long pants, I think.
Knickers.
Yeah, I think he's wearing knickers. Yeah.
There's no electricity.
Yeah, we don't see any electric lines, right?
And interestingly, nobody is really looking at the camera except for that young boy and the man behind.
Yeah, no one is looking at the camera. So yeah.
Buying, selling going on.
All right, so we see kind of commerce. We also see, you guys probably can't read this, but there are some words here at the bottom. And it says life on the Lower East Side, COR, Pitt, and Rivington. Streets, North New York.
Yeah, I was looking directly inside the perimeter picture, but my first eyes went to where is this over there on the side.
Okay, so the title?
Yeah.
Yeah. So when you do primary source analysis, and this is where you as the teacher can kind of control that. Like if you wanted to, you could just give your students the image, or you could actually give them the image with the title and the date. And so that kind of depends on how much information you want to provide with them as you start the analysis. Yes?
When I've done this with my students, I take the title and date off and all that stuff, and I just have them look at the picture. The problem with the students, which I did not notice in here, which was I was kind of thrilled about, is that students immediately try to interpret the image. They immediately say, oh, well, that's a city, and there's a lot of people buying stuff, and all this. And I'm like, no. You just want to identify the objects that you see, and I noticed that here.
Yeah, that is the tricky part. Yeah, so you want to kind of take that next step, which is basically what do we know? And so helping them to kind of label these kind of what do we see, what do we know, and then what do we wonder, and taking the questions individually. And so when they make an observation, so if they were say commerce, say, well, how do we know that? What do we see? What evidence do we see here that helps us to draw that conclusion? And so that's a good way to kind of help them to take a step back and actually work on those observation skills before we start to apply what do we know with what we see. Adults, we all do that. We see the information and jump 3 steps ahead. So what do we know? What do we know that can help us understand this image?
It was the most populated place in the entire world.
Okay, yeah. Right, so yeah, so dense population right here.
A lot of immigrants during that time. The Lower East Side was horrible with the immigrant
Right.
population.
Yeah, and within that population, we have a large number of immigrant communities.
Child labor?
Child labor.
Sanitation was not.
Yeah, sanitation wasn't that great, which we can, probably, I mean, another thing I like to when you look at these images, you have your students say, okay, well, what do you imagine this might have smelled like? And so to put their other senses into it when they look at images. So, what do we see here? What do we think that might smell like? And so, like, was there regular trash collection? What was the sewage system like? Rainwater collection, all of those kind of things, and how that would have impacted the sensory environment there.
And this is, in terms of helping us understand that, this is 3 years before the influenza pandemic, Spanish influenza pandemic, so that might help.
Okay, so yeah, so we know that, yeah, there in just a few years, many people are going to die from Spanish flu. What else do we know?
I would say those buildings are probably the tenement buildings that they lived in. That
All right, we know people lived in tenement houses. It's likely that some of these might have been some of those tenement houses. We know within those tenement houses, large numbers of people lived in very small spaces. What do we wonder? What questions do we have?
How many different types of immigrants do you have in this one area?
Right. So is this kind of one immigrant community here, or do we have multiple immigrant communities that are living close together?
Why are the young children? There's a young boy, and there's also seems to be a young girl.
Yeah,
And why are they there? What are they doing?
Okay, yeah. So why are the kids in the street? Like, is this on a weekend? Were they off to work? Did they go to school? What was daily life like for the kids?
Why are signs so scarce? Like I only see one sign on the building on one side, and then there's one on the other side, but
Yeah.
in
There's several,
contrast
they're
to-
just really dark.
Yeah, so why is signage not more visible? Because we're used to really bold signage in our streets. So yeah, so why?
What languages are they speaking?
Yeah, what languages are they speaking?
What's being bought and sold? How much do those items cost?
Okay, yeah.
I'm wondering why the streets are so dirty.
Okay. Yeah, why were they so dirty? Like, again, when we get back to sanitation, like, what was the sanitation practices? Like, was there regular trash collection? Did no one teach them about litter?
How many bathrooms are there in each tent?
Yeah, good question.
The smell of the non-showered, non-bathed people.
So as you go through this with your students and have them, come up with their questions, the next step really is kind of helping them to prioritize their questions. So, one thing they go, okay, which ones can we, are there any that we can pretty easily answer? Are there ones that are probably more important to what we're trying to learn from this image? And begin to prioritize those questions. And that's really almost a whole separate skill set, is helping students to develop good questions and learning how to prioritize those. But it's a good way to work that into primary source analysis, because when you have them develop those questions out of what do you wonder, you can then have them start to go through and think, okay, again, what's the most important questions here? Which ones can we answer? Are there some that we're probably not going to be able to determine the answer to? We probably are not going to be able to find out exactly who this young boy is. But we probably could find out what life was like for children who lived in this community more generally, instead of finding out specifically. And so having them think about, again, what is it possible for us to answer versus what we probably are not going to be able to find source material for. And then if we went into inquiry, having them think, okay, well, where do we go to begin to find the answers to these questions? So the format that we use for this, the what do you see, what do you know, what do you wonder, really stems from this worksheet, which is developed by the Library of Congress. So you'll see on the copy that you're getting, it's a two-sided sheet, and so you have the blank-sided copy that you can give to your students where they would fill it out. So again, you might even have them at the beginning of each of the columns where it says observe, reflect, and question. Go at their beginning of it and have them put, what do I see? What do I know? And then what do I wonder, to help them, again, focus in on the question that you're asking for each one of these different columns. Now, for the teacher side, which is what you guys are seeing here, you'll see that it's labeled observe, reflect, and question. and that there are some guiding questions that you can use to help your students kind of prompt them through this process. Because again, especially as they're first getting used to primary source analysis, they may hit some stumbling blocks, and so these questions are really just a way to kind of help prod them along in thinking about what do they see. So for example, you're having them describe what did you notice first, how are they arranged, physical setting, do we see any words, are there other details that you can see, and then having them go forward with the other reflect and question portions. Now, the Library of Congress has developed several different formats for this, and so I think I gave you guys the ones for just general primary source analysis. They do have them that are kind of more specifically tailored to different formats of sources. So like this one right here is for photographs and prints. They have one for manuscripts, sound recordings, maps. They just tailor those teacher-guided questions just a bit to the specific format of the source. Now, the other thing that you'll notice on this form that we don't always spend a lot of time on is the bottom portion, where it says further investigation. And this is where students can begin to think about how do I jump from the wonder phase of inquiry into investigate. And so having them begin to think about, again, which are my questions am I going to try to answer out of wonder? Where am I going to go to find the answers to those questions, and basically begin to develop an idea for how they're going to research the answers to those. And so this is where we get into investigate and construct within the inquiry cycle. Now, what is really interesting about this, again, thinking about how we can connect social studies to ELA, and so that, when we're trying to find more instruction time for our students, how we can begin to bridge these two content areas, and maybe even do some team teaching, is that this type of primary source analysis really lends itself well to those type of skill sets. And so, for example, within the ELA skill sets, we see that just the first two columns, we're hitting on standards that are going to hit on reading closely to determine what the text says explicitly. We're going to have to cite text evidence. We're going to have to summarize key supporting details and ideas. We're going to have to make inferences and draw conclusions and determine central ideas and themes. We're also, within the what do you know portion, going to have to interpret words and phrases to figure out how they're used in a text. We're going to have to analyze specific word choices, text structure, and then assess point of view and purpose. And then finally, for the wonder and for our further investigation, we are going to have to hit on skill sets with the integration of knowledge and ideas. So we're going to have to think about analyzing how and why individuals' ideas and events interact over the course of a source. We're going to have to evaluate how to diverse formats and how that's presented, integrate that information. We're going to have to evaluate arguments and claims, and we're going to have to analyze multiple texts, figure out how they connect and how different themes build off of each other within these different texts. And so really, if we think about it, these three basic questions when we're doing primary source analysis can really lead our students to develop a wide array of skills that will help us and help them to develop those critical thinking skills. So when we think about analysis and how that fits in with, again, those ELA skills, we're really hitting on 15 different skill sets. So, we see them here, and you can take primary source analysis and shape it so that you're really digging into, specific skill sets if you wanted to devise activities around that, or that you are kind of more broadly hitting on these within general primary source analysis. So I want us to think about that image that we just analyzed. So think about that image for a second. And so if we were to think about multiple sources and supporting details, just those two, multiple sources and supporting details. And we were to think about that image, and then if we were to go back and think about this image. So if we were to use those two together, multiple sources, so we've got multiple sources, we've got two, supporting details. How can we make these two sources work together to help our students to understand supporting details?
Well, you're looking at life in those buildings compared to the life outside the building.
Okay.
So you could do something like that.
Okay.
Since homes of the poor, you need supporting details. How could you support that is a poor home?
Okay.
That was how much progress is made in 30, 40 years between this source and the other source.
Which also builds into one of the other skills there, which is change over time, right? So we have the sources, you know, about 20, 30 years earlier. So we can talk about change over time and how we could use supporting details to talk about what did that change look like between these two sources. Other ideas?
Did you do something with the technology?
Yeah.
You got the sketch versus the playground.
All right. So that builds in diverse formats, right? So we have a kind of an illustration here versus the photograph. So how do these two different types of images, how do they help tell this story? In what ways do they support each other? In what ways are they different? How do they get their point across and their message across? And again, thinking about that both of these images are really kind of talk to us in some ways about the life of immigrant communities during the time period. We could look, the image talked to, the photograph we saw showed us kind of life from a street level, right? The outside, the public life. This is showing us kind of the home life, right? And so we could think about, if we take these two, what conclusions could we draw about lives of immigrants during this kind of larger period of time?
I think it opens up a hole in going, how widespread was the poverty? How extensive was that level? Because the inside-outside pictures don't really give us much of a gauge about just how extensive was this. Was this a very small slice of the population, or is this the norm?
Yeah. So maybe it leads us to some larger questions that we can answer. And I think that that's another important step in this. And every time we introduce a new source to our students, we want them to evaluate, okay, so how did this help? If we look at this source in comparison to our photograph, does this help us answer any questions? What new questions do we develop? And so, thinking about, how widespread was poverty within immigrant communities? And then we could think about what sources do we want to look at to help us to answer that. And we're actually going to look at one that will help us answer that question a little bit.
Kind of riding on the coattails of that. That goes to source analysis in terms of, are we seeing an agenda here? Is this something that Harpers Ferry is trying to put forth? Is the photo, like you were saying, is that a normal thing? Or was this on a market day? Was this on a holiday? Is this a normal kind of human traffic on that street? Or are we seeing something that the photographer and the sketcher and the publisher are trying to convince us is there that is not really there? So
yes,
you want to look at the source and the reliability of the source.
Yes, so when we get back again to our skills here, we want to think about point of view and purpose. We always want to think about those when we're looking at a source. And when we start to put sources together, think about are the point of view and the purposes, do they align? Or are we looking at things that are coming from different points of view and different purposes to help give us a bigger picture? So that's kind of one level of analysis. Now, if we want to go kind of the next level with this, which is kind of what we're hitting on here with thinking about some of these skill sets, and that is getting into historical thinking. And when we think about historical thinking, what we're wanting students to do is to be able to interpret, analyze, and use information in order to really be able to accomplish some very specific types of skills within the history field. And I think for students, this is where history can be very interesting. And so that we get them away from that whole it's memorization of names, dates, and places, and it's boring. This is where history is very active. And so thinking about chronological thinking. So when we thought about those two images before, that we could think about that the Harper's illustration image was 30 years before. And we begin to place that on a timeline and can figure out how that fits into our overall knowledge of the period. Historical comprehension, analysis and interpretation, research capabilities, and then thinking about issue analysis and decision making. And these are much higher level thinking skills and very specific, of course, to the history field. Now, for most students, for middle school students, this is something you can begin to introduce to them, but some of this is going to be challenging for middle school students. But for high school students, definitely something that we can be challenging them to learn and to think about when they're looking at primary sources. And if you're teaching AP, of course, this really is kind of the crux for what AP students are being asked to do when they do their exams. So within historical thinking, we have started using a guide that kind of goes along with, we call it our HIPPO form, because it breaks down essentially into 5 categories. And so when we look at a source, we want to think about these 5 categories of analysis. So historical context, audience, point of view, purpose, and outside information. And so you guys are going to get a graphic organizer that we've been using that kind of goes along with this model that you can use with your students. And of course, with either of these analysis worksheets, you can of course then take and tailor them and do them specifically for different types of activities. And we've had teachers do that with some of the lesson plans they've developed for us. So when we think about these different categories, when we think about context, what we want our students to do is to connect that document with the specific historical event, circumstance of time and place, and the broader idea. So we basically, in their minds, if they could picture like history as a timeline on the wall, that they could look at that source and fit it in that timeline, and they can see what's around it, right? So that they can understand how this fits into the broader historical era. That they understand when and where the source was created. So getting back to sourcing, which if you guys are familiar at all with Sam Weinberg and the work that they do, they talk a lot about sourcing. So that they, students initially look for when was it created, where was it created, and then eventually who created it. What was going on when the author created the document or created the source? So again, we're thinking about context. And then thinking about, in general, once we've identified that information, how does this help us to better understand what we can learn from this document? So when we think about context, these are essentially the key questions that we want students to think about and answer when identifying the context for a specific source.
Would you suggest for the HIPPO model, you would use that on one of the primary sources, the pictures, for a higher level?
Yes.
To go
Yeah, you could definitely do that. Really, I mean, with any of, you can really do almost with any primary source, but I think it depends, like if you're just introducing this with students, I think I would start with an image so that, you're not scaring them with text along with introducing kind of new, more challenging questions as well. So if you introduce this with sources that they're more comfortable with, that they can more easily access, and then kind of up the ante once they get comfortable with kind of the process for analysis.
Using the pictures also targets, helps students with lower reading.
Yes. Yeah. A lot of times when we develop activities, we will start with some sort of image or visual, and then introduce a text as kind of the next source to help them answer it, so that students, all students can begin to access the lesson and the activity, and then that if you're working in groups and stuff, that you can then place your students. So if you have struggling readers, you can put them with people who can help them, and then we can also try to put in some supports to help those students. So for example, vocabulary, we might reword things. And some of our later sessions today, especially the next one when Stacy talks about complex text, she'll talk a lot about kind of reading supports to help struggling readers. Okay, so once your students have went through and have looked at context, then you want them to think about audience. Who was going to see the source, right? What was the person or group that the author expected to view, to read? Who were they trying to influence? Because it's almost as important to understand who was going to see it and who they were trying to speak to uncover purpose as it is to figure out who actually created it. And then thinking about who that audience is, how do they affect the tone and content? So for example, we have a source that we use in one of our activities that is a Confederate soldier who is speaking to the Daughters of the Confederacy about 20 years after the war, essentially recollecting his experiences, and he calls it humorous incidents in the Civil War, right? So when we're thinking about what he talks about within that, again, it's all primary source information, it's his experiences, but we know he is speaking at invitation to the Daughters of the Confederacy. So how does knowing who his audience is help us to understand how we can evaluate what he says? Right? So if we think about, like, if he's speaking to a group of women in the late 1800s, there are certain things that he probably wouldn't have talked about. He probably wouldn't have talked about, the realities of war in quite the same way. He definitely would have toned down kind of the graphic nature of the brutality of war to some degree. And we think about kind of those gender relationships during the time period. We also think about that he's a Confederate veteran teaching to a group of women who were, daughters of Confederacy, and so, they have this shared commonality as far as their viewpoints on the war, more than likely. So again, that's going to help us to understand how they're coming at it. So you can have your students look at that. You might have them think about it from that direction, and then you might flip it and say, okay, well, how might he have addressed this topic differently had he been speaking to a group of fellow veterans? How might it have changed if he'd been speaking with a mixed group of both Union and Confederate veterans? And so when we think about how, if we put different people in that audience, how that would have changed how he would have talked about it, can help students to kind of think about this process, right? Think about how audience really matters. Or if you want to break it down to them, like think about it, how would you describe what you did last night to your best friend versus how you would tell it to your mom or dad? So audience matters, right? Point of view. So going back to identifying who was the person who created the source, we wanted to think about their relationship to the event. So if we go back to our Civil War veteran, he fought in the war, he was there in the midst of it. That's going to help us to understand his point of view. How does that affect the author's understanding of the event? So are they someone who is in the midst of what's going on? Are they on the periphery? What is their relationship to what it is that they're talking about within the source that they created? And then how reliable are they? We want to think about reliability within our sources. Then you also want to think about it from the standpoint of kind of specific, gender, age, ethnicity, social status, economic status, religious belief, political beliefs, position, and job. And that all of this can help us to understand the source to and evaluate it. Purpose. So to some extent, point of view and purpose can sort of align and overlap just a little bit. So we want to think about why the author created it. So what essentially, when he's talking to that audience, what is he trying to accomplish? He or she trying to accomplish? Are they just trying to inform? Are they persuading, entertaining? So again, our Civil War veteran, he was largely trying to entertain these ladies. So again, humorous incidents in the life of the Civil War. He's wanting to just share the funny stories that he has from the times that he was fighting. And that can help us to kind of understand, again, what we can learn from the source. And then finally, outside information. So this one can be a little more unclear for students. So thinking about what historical information we can get from the document that's maybe unrelated to the specific main idea. So maybe something that's not specifically stated, but that somewhat connects, right? So maybe kind of that tangential information. And then how does this help us to make our argument? So if we think about, again, our Civil War guy, as he's talking to these ladies, we might want to figure out, okay, well, what were the daughters of the Confederacy doing, and why were they inviting him in to have this talk? So what's going on within kind of the creation of Civil War memory during the time period that he's speaking to them that can help us to understand why this is going on? And then how does that help us to better understand both what life was like for people who had fought in the Civil War for the Confederacy years later, and how they were coping with those experiences and trying to bring, as the nation was coming back together. And whether that, looking at it, was that during the Reconstruction time period, was that post-Reconstruction, and then again thinking about context and how that fits into the larger historical narrative. Now, one other thing that you can think about within all of this is significance. And that might be something that you also introduce to your students and thinking about within all of this, within our source, with what we're looking at, why does it matter? Why is it important that we look at this, the source? How does it help us to understand that bigger thing? Does it help us to understand the bigger picture? Why is it important? So I want us to think about all of this in relation to this source, kind of coming back to immigration. So what I want your tables to do, again, focusing on those two paragraphs, the first two complete paragraphs on the third column, is to go through and think about these questions for historical analysis. So context, intended audience, point of view, purpose, and outside information.
What was occurring basically? They're getting more.
Yeah, so $20
For example, in 1920, if you could buy a multi-Ford for $265 or $50, $60.
Exchange rate between 1907.
They would say the $20 back in the day would be a lot. Is that right, Ms. Morse?
Right.
So their chances of fortune now, even today. That's what it is today. That's what it is today. I mean, jobs available.
Okay, so let's talk about this. So first off, the newspaper article that you guys have, I accessed through Chronicling America. And if you like to use newspapers in your classroom, Chronicling America is my favorite database available through the Library of Congress.
What's it called again?
Chronicling America. It is an NEH-funded project that's been working for several years to try to digitize large portions of America's newspapers. And so it runs from, I want to think like 1830, 1840 to 1922. And you can go in, you can search them by state, you can search by individual papers, but you can access these the papers, and then you can be able to zoom in so that you can actually read those in amazing detail. So when we think about, we're teaching immigration, for example, tons of great information that we can get that really kind of helps us to dig into what the conversations were around immigration during the time period. So that's what we have here. So what did you guys come up with on context? What is the context for our excerpt here?
I was wondering about the newspaper itself, if the Tribune had a particular agenda or political stance, and where it kind of fit into the political debates of the time, especially on, obviously, on immigration.
Now, one thing that is great about Chronicling America is they have biography pages or bibliographic pages for the individual papers. And within those, there's actually a short kind of summary information about the paper, and oftentimes it will give us a little bit of that. And so when we look at that, we could actually have our students come in and read through this and kind of get a bit of the background about the paper. All right.
So a lot of people were immigrating to the United States.
Yes. So we know there's lots of immigration during the time period. What else? Anything else for context?
Well, we know that Asian immigration had been limited already by law, but that was the extent of the limitation so far.
Right, that we did have some limitation, more so with kind of the Chinese Exclusion Act. But we're still talking about, what do we do with these large numbers of immigrants who are coming into the country?
America's fighting a war in the Philippines.
Right. Yeah, Spanish-American War. So, intended audience. Who was the audience here?
I'd say it's geared to those people who have been here for a while.
Okay.
So, people who might have that religious attitude.
Okay. Point of view. What's the point of view of the author?
The reporter or the government commissioner quoted?
Well, let's start with the commission, yeah.
He thinks immigration is a bad thing.
All right. Okay, he's definitely making an argument that we need to limit it, right?
It's a quote made at this point.
Okay.
The reporter, though, has done an interesting thing, is after quoting the commissioner's report, it brings up the economic status of the immigrants and points out, if I did the numbers correctly, more than 2/3 of them, of that total number, then represent people coming to the country with very little money at all.
Okay. So yeah, so we have the commissioner who's making this that essentially, our system is being overtaxed and this is going to continue if something isn't done. And then the reporter comes in and adds the economic angle to this and talks about essentially how much money they're coming into the country, which we think about it, he's making an argument essentially that we have this number coming in, but they're coming in with very little resources. So again, almost he's coming back in and supporting what the commissioner is saying about the dangers of continued immigration at these levels. So the purpose. What do you think the author's purpose here is?
To generate popular support for more limitation.
Okay, yeah. And yeah, why we need to support federal limitation on immigration.
We noticed that they singled out one country in particular in the subtitle of the article with the Japanese.
Yeah.
We don't know that more Japanese came than other continents.
Yeah, so that would help us give us a question. Yeah, give us a question. We might want to look at how did the number of Japanese during that period compare with other groups who are coming into the country.
They're setting up a little bit of a us against them scenario by saying the United States as a race. Like, so many races, but we're a race, the United States. So
yeah. So that would be a good point to point out to your students and discuss, and why is the author talk about it from that standpoint? How might someone else view it differently? All right, outside information. Is there anything else here kind of unrelated to the specific question of kind of immigration he's speaking out that we can draw in?
Interesting reference in the world that the European countries were talking about legislation to restrict outflow.
Yeah. Yeah, I found that really interesting. Yeah, so that not only was this a question going on with the U.S., essentially, what are we going to do with all these people coming in, but that European nations were like, what are we going to do with all of our people leaving, and how is that going to impact us? So thinking about it again from a different perspective. So this piece right here is actually a source that we use in a lesson plan we have on immigration. It's a case study in multiple perspectives in diverse formats, and it's one of about 4 or 5 different sources that is used in that lesson plan, so you can really dig in, look at some different sources, and think about these skill sets of perspective and how that perspective is evident in these different sources, and how different types of sources help to make that point differently. And so there's music, there's an oral history, there's another image that you can look at. We also have 3 different newsletters that we've done looking at historical thinking, and so there are different lesson ideas, different links within that you can explore. And again, I'll get you guys a copy of this PowerPoint so that you can access the links for those.